The cart was still warm from the sun when the store manager found it, wedged crookedly between two parking spaces, wheels locked at odd angles, like someone had shoved it and let go mid-motion. Inside, under a bag of frozen peas already sweating into the plastic, there was one piece of paper. A grocery list. Blue ink, slanted hard to the right. Milk, eggs, coffee filters, birthday candles. And at the bottom, underlined twice, pressed so hard it nearly tore the page, call him back tonight. Nobody standing in that quiet, sun-bleached parking lot knew it yet. But that damp, ordinary scrap of paper was about to become the last coherent thought of a living woman. There is no drama in a grocery list. No warning folded into birthday candles. That is what makes it unbearable now, laminated in an evidence sleeve, photographed from 4 angles under fluorescent light. It looks like nothing. It looks like a life still in motion. A woman thinking about coffee in the morning. A woman planning a small celebration. A woman who fully intended to come home. Her name was Renata Colby, 34, a dental hygienist. The kind of woman who left a spare key with her elderly neighbor in case he fell and couldn't reach the phone. Who carried in the mail for the family upstairs whenever they traveled. Her mother called her every Sunday at 6 p.m. 11 straight years, unbroken. On the Tuesday she disappeared, that call rang 4 times and dropped to voicemail, and something about the silence on the other end made her mother's stomach drop before there was any evidence to justify it. What almost nobody remembered, until much later, was a small, forgettable comment made 2 months earlier by a part-time cashier at that same store. She'd mentioned, half joking, to a coworker, that a maintenance man kept lingering near the registers on nights Renata worked her evening shopping trips, watching a little too long, saying nothing at all. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought it mattered. It was just a strange man being strange, the kind of detail a small town absorbs and forgets within a week. The first search of Renata's apartment revealed nothing violent. A made bed. A cup of chamomile tea gone cold and filmy on the counter. No broken lock. No overturned furniture. It looked like a woman who had stepped out for 5 minutes and never come back, as if she'd paused her own life mid-sentence to answer a knock nobody else heard. There was a calendar tacked to the refrigerator, the kind with a small square for every day of the month, and in the square for that Tuesday, in the same slanted blue ink as the grocery list, Renata had written a single word, birthday. Beneath it, smaller, almost an afterthought, she had written the initial J, followed by a small drawn heart that had been scratched out and redrawn twice, as if she couldn't decide whether the gesture embarrassed her. Nobody in her immediate circle of friends or family could identify anyone in her life whose name began with that letter and who mattered enough to warrant a heart on her calendar. Her mother, when shown the photograph of that square months later, simply stared at it for a long time and said nothing at all, because it meant her daughter had been keeping something from her, something tender enough to draw a heart over and private enough to never once mention across 11 years of unbroken Sunday phone calls. The apartment held other small contradictions too, the kind that mean nothing on their own but accumulate, over the course of an investigation, into something that feels uncomfortably deliberate. A second toothbrush in the bathroom cabinet, and used, still in its packaging, the sort of thing a person buys when they are quietly preparing for someone else to eventually need it. A receipt for a hotel 40 minutes outside the city, dated 6 weeks before her disappearance, paid in cash, for a single night under a reservation made in Renata's name alone. When investigators drove out to that hotel and questioned the front desk staff, nobody remembered her clearly enough to say whether she had checked in alone or with company, and the security footage from that period had long since been overwritten by the hotel's own limited storage policy, another small window of visibility closed simply by the ordinary passage of time rather than by any deliberate hand. Detective Miriam Ashworth caught the case the next morning. She'll tell you now, flatly, that her first instinct was skepticism. 19 years on the force teaches you that. Adults leave. Adults carry secrets. She expected this file to close itself within the week. Then came the call about the cart. Melted groceries. An untouched purse still on the passenger seat of Renata's locked car. $43 folded neatly in the wallet. A phone, dead battery, sitting in the cup holder exactly where she'd have left it walking into the store. A woman does not leave her wallet behind. She does not walk 30 feet from her own phone and keep walking. Something, or someone, had interrupted her with enough force, or enough persuasion, to make her abandon every trace of herself in one terrible instant. Ashworth stood in that lot at dusk and did the math out loud. 30 feet. 3 working cameras. A town where people still know their mail carrier's name. When the footage came back, the exact 11 minutes covering that stretch of asphalt had dissolved into static. Clean. Total. Faulty hardware, the technicians said. Ashworth didn't believe it for a second. Bad luck has a texture. This wasn't it. This felt cut. The grocery list became an obsession on her desk. Ink traced to a pen sold in every pharmacy in the state. A dead end. But that phrase, "call him back tonight," wouldn't let her sleep. It meant Renata had been avoiding someone's call that day. Someone she felt obligated, or frightened, to phone back. Phone records surfaced 14 calls in 6 weeks from an unregistered prepaid number, bought in cash to vanish from any database. A coworker, Priya Okafor, remembered Renata taking one such call in the break room 10 days before she disappeared. Her voice dropped into a register Priya had never heard. Quiet. Clipped. Almost pleading. Afterward, her hands trembled as she reorganized files that didn't need reorganizing. That trembling detail became the emotional center of the early investigation. And somewhere in it, the case stopped being paperwork for Ashworth. It became personal. 19 years earlier, her own younger sister walked out of a laundromat carrying a basket of unfolded towels and never came home. That case went cold and stayed cold. Ashworth joined the academy 3 years later. She never mentioned it to a single colleague. Not until this file cracked something open she'd kept sealed for 2 decades. Colleagues who worked alongside her in those early years describe a woman who was competent, thorough, and almost aggressively private. Someone who left the building the moment her shift ended and rarely joined the informal gatherings other officers used to unwind after difficult cases, preferring instead the solitary quiet of her own apartment, where, according to one former partner, she kept the television off most nights simply to think in silence. It was not until Renata's case, according to one retired sergeant who trained her, that anyone saw Ashworth stay past midnight without being asked, poring over case files at her own kitchen table with an intensity that seemed to exceed even her considerable professional standards. When that same sergeant finally asked her, gently, whether this case reminded her of anything, Ashworth reportedly went quiet for nearly a full minute before answering, admitting for the first time in 19 years that she still kept her sister's laundromat receipt taped inside a drawer she never opened in front of anyone else, the last physical proof that her sister had existed in the world at all on the day she vanished from it. That confession, small as it was, changed the way Ashworth approached every subsequent decision in the investigation. She began requesting overtime she wasn't required to take. She pushed for search warrants that her captain initially deemed excessive given the available evidence. She drove, on her own time and her own gas money, out to the state park where the prepaid phone had eventually been found, walking the surrounding trails alone for hours on a weekend when she was technically off duty, searching for anything the original recovery team might have missed in their haste to process the scene and move on to the next task on an overburdened schedule. Nothing came of that particular search. But those who knew her best say it was never really about finding evidence that day. It was about proving to herself that she would not let this case slip away the way her sisters had, buried under the quiet, grinding indifference of a system that simply runs out of time and resources long before it runs out of unanswered questions. 2 weeks into the search, an envelope appeared taped to Ashworth's own front door. No postage. No name. Inside, a photograph of her house, taken from across the street at dusk. On the back, block letters pressed hard enough to dent the paper. Stop asking about the list. She didn't stop. She told almost no one, logged it into evidence, and started double-checking her own locks before bed. It was the first sign this wasn't a passive mystery to solve from behind a desk. Someone was watching how close she got. A forensic accountant, brought in to check for debt or blackmail, found something nobody had thought to search for. $62,000, nearly all of Renata's savings, had drained out over 14 months into an account tied to no bank she'd ever disclosed. She'd told everyone she was saving for a house. The realtor she claimed to be working with didn't exist. A cover story built to survive Thanksgiving dinner questions, never built to survive a disappearance. The trail led to a private post office box, rented in cash under a fake name, renewed every 6 months by a man in a baseball cap pulled low enough to defeat any camera. What began as a welfare check had become something with real architecture to it. $62,000, bleeding quietly towards someone who'd worked hard to stay invisible. Tracing that money required a level of cooperation between local police and federal financial crime analysts that Ashworth had never before needed on a single case. Subpoenas crossing state lines, intermediary banks in 2 separate jurisdictions stalling for weeks behind layers of routine compliance procedure before finally releasing the records that mattered. Each new document that arrived on her desk felt, she later admitted, like pulling a single thread out of a sweater without any way of knowing whether it would unravel the whole garment or simply snap off in her hand, leaving her no closer to the shape underneath. There were nights during this stretch of the investigation when Ashworth would sit alone in the department's records room until well past midnight, spreading transfer receipts and routing numbers across a folding table in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone else who happened to walk past, tracing a woman's slow, deliberate financial disappearance one wire transfer at a time. Long before anyone understood that Renata herself was about to disappear as completely as her money had. The forensic accountant assigned to the case, a meticulous man named Devin Achterberg who had spent the better part of his career untangling corporate fraud rather than missing person cases, would later describe this particular financial trail as one of the most deliberately obscured he had ever encountered outside of organized crime investigations. Structured in a way that suggested whoever was receiving the money understood exactly how such transfers are typically flagged and had built each transaction specifically to fall just beneath every threshold that might otherwise trigger automatic reporting to federal regulators. It was not the work, he noted, of an amateur extorting a frightened woman out of desperation. It was patient. It was careful. And patience, in Achterberg's long professional experience, is far more frightening in a case like this than impulsiveness ever could be, because it suggests a person who was never in any hurry at all, someone content to let the money accumulate slowly across more than a year without ever once tipping their hand. 3 months in, a hiker found a weathered phone buried under leaves 90 miles away. It matched the mystery number exactly. For one hell-breath moment, Ashworth believed she finally had her answer. What the recovered data actually showed dismantled everything. The phone belonged to Renata's own brother. The same brother who'd reported her missing with what looked, in every interview, like genuine devastation. Buried in the recovered texts was a man drowning in secret debt from a failed business, pressuring his sister for money using fabricated stories about their mother's health. The trembling voice in the break room. The invented house. All of it. Renata quietly bankrolling her brother's collapse rather than break their mother's heart. It looked, finally, like a motive. Ashworth tore his alibi apart in an afternoon. And in that same afternoon, it collapsed the other way. Cell tower data placed him 600 miles away at 7:52 p.m., minutes after his sister vanished. He'd betrayed her, extorted her for months. But he hadn't taken her. He physically could not have. He broke down in interrogation, sobbing that his last conversations with his sister were built on lies designed to keep the money coming, and that he had no idea, none, who could have hurt her. Whatever judgment history holds for him, he wasn't the answer. Ashworth was dragged back to an even darker starting point, because the secret Renata had guarded so carefully had nothing to do with what actually happened to her. What made this revelation particularly difficult for the family to absorb was the discovery, buried among the recovered text messages, of a final exchange between brother and sister that had taken place only 2 days before Renata vanished. In it, Renata had written, with a bluntness that surprised even the detectives reading it months later, that this would be the last transfer she was willing to make, that she loved him but could not keep bleeding herself dry to cover debts he refused to explain honestly, and that she intended to tell their mother everything the following week regardless of what it cost their relationship. The brother's reply, sent 11 minutes later, contained only 4 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life once investigators shared their contents with him during questioning. Please don't do that. It was not a threat. It was not, on its surface, anything resembling a motive for violence. But it meant that in the final days of her life, whatever else was happening to her, Renata Colby had also been quietly preparing to detonate a family secret that had cost her nearly everything she'd saved, a decision she never lived long enough to see through. Ashworth found herself unable to fully separate her professional judgment from a private, aching sympathy for this brother even after his alibi cleared him completely, because she recognized in his desperate, cowardly manipulation of his own sister something she had seen before in far smaller, quieter forms throughout her career, the particular way that ordinary people, under enough financial pressure, will convince themselves that love and exploitation can occupy the same sentence without contradiction. It never made him a suspect worth pursuing. It did make him, in her private notes on the case, someone she found almost impossible to forgive, regardless of what the law ultimately determined he was guilty of. By now the case had escaped local news entirely. Regional outlets picked it up first, then national true crime commentators, drawn to exactly the kind of details that keep a disappearance alive for years instead of a single news cycle. It was during a second, far more exhaustive search of the lot, for months in, against her captain's quiet objection that resources were being wasted, that Ashworth found the thread that finally moved. Ground-penetrating equipment revealed a storm drain 60 feet from where the cart had sat. Inside it, a single earring, later confirmed by Renata's mother as one Renata wore that day. The drain connected underground to a maintenance tunnel beneath the shopping center, sealed and marked decommissioned 2 years earlier. Ashworth forced her way in with a 2-officer team, flashlights cutting through stale, dust-thick air. A folded blanket, an empty water bottle manufactured within the timeline, and scratched faintly into the concrete. A tally. The kind a person carves when they've lost every other way to measure time. That same night, driving home past midnight, a car matched her every turn for 11 miles. Headlights steady in her mirror. It peeled off the instant she pulled into a gas station with working cameras. The plate came back stolen, discarded 2 days later in a ditch 40 miles north, wiped clean. This wasn't a puzzle anymore, waiting patiently to be solved. It was watching itself get solved, and it was close enough to reach her. Then came a second scare, smaller but sharper. A week later, a box of evidence photographs went missing from a locked cabinet inside the precinct itself. No forced entry, no broken lock. Just gone, and back on the shelf 2 days later as if it had never left, except one photograph inside it was missing entirely. The single frame showing the tunnel entrance from the outside. Someone with access to that building had touched the case file, and Ashworth had no way of proving who. The internal investigation that followed was quiet, almost apologetically so, conducted by an officer from an entirely different division specifically to avoid the appearance of the department investigating itself. Access logs for the evidence room showed nothing unusual, no unauthorized badge swipes, no gaps in the security camera coverage of the hallway leading to the cabinet, which meant, if the logs could be trusted at all, that whoever had taken and returned that photograph held legitimate access to the building, a possibility that unsettled Ashworth more than any external threat could have. She began keeping duplicate copies of every significant piece of evidence at home from that point forward, backed up on an encrypted drive she carried with her at all times. A level of personal precaution that her captain quietly noted in her file as either exceptional diligence or the early symptoms of a detective who had started to see threats in every shadow of a case that had already cost her more sleep than any assignment in her 19 years on the force. Whether that caution was justified or simply the product of exhaustion, an old grief resurfacing at the worst possible time became, in its own strange way, part of the unresolved texture of this case. One more question layered atop dozens of others that would never receive a clean answer. One more small mystery folded quietly into a much larger one that was already refusing, at every turn, to resolve itself the way everyone investigating it so badly needed it to. Personnel records for every contractor and maintenance worker with tunnel access over the past decade ran into the hundreds once every subcontractor was counted. Buried in it was a name that stopped the task force cold. Walton Reyes, a maintenance supervisor terminated 18 months before Renata vanished, after internal records vaguely cited a serious violation of workplace conduct. Former coworkers said multiple women had once reported feeling watched, followed, their belongings quietly moved in locked areas during shifts he had no reason to be present for. It was, suddenly, the same lingering man the part-time cashier had mentioned in passing months earlier and nobody had thought to write down. Ashworth pulled the original human resources file on his termination and found it thinner than she expected, only a handful of pages documenting complaints that had clearly been treated, at the time, as minor personnel friction rather than anything approaching a genuine warning sign. One complaint, filed by a woman who no longer worked at the shopping center and proved difficult to track down, described finding her locker rearranged, its contents refolded with an unsettling precision, nothing missing, nothing damaged, simply touched by hands that had no business being there at all. Another complaint mentioned a folded note left inside an employee break room cubby, and signed, containing only a single line of handwriting that the complainant had described to her supervisor as making her skin crawl, though the note itself had apparently been discarded before anyone thought to preserve it as evidence of anything. None of these complaints, individually, had ever been treated as urgent. Collectively, viewed now against the backdrop of a hidden tunnel and a missing woman, they formed a portrait of a man who had been quietly testing the boundaries of what he could get away with for years before anyone in a position of authority took real notice. A slow escalation that management had repeatedly failed to connect into any coherent pattern, choosing instead to treat each incident as an isolated, forgettable nuisance rather than a warning about who Walton Reyes actually was. Underneath the unremarkable surface of a man who fixed broken air conditioners and replaced burnt-out light fixtures for a living, Reyes was found living 2 counties away under a slightly altered name, his job application riddled with small, deliberate gaps a background check should have caught and never did. In his first interview, he was unnervingly calm. Rehearsed, almost. He denied ever meeting Renata, denied recognizing her photograph, denied any memory of a tunnel he claimed not to have entered in over a year. Forensic evidence outlasts even a well-rehearsed denial. DNA from the blanket matched him across 2 independent labs. A warrant on his rental home turned up, locked inside a garage toolbox, an unsigned birthday card addressed simply to Renata, dated the week her birthday would have arrived. 1 week after she vanished. It should have been the resolution everyone needed. It wasn't. Confronted with the DNA, Reyes admitted only to using the tunnel before, admitted to a fixation that curdled into something disturbing after watching her face on the news for weeks, but denied, for 6 straight hours, that she had ever actually been down there. Prosecutors, bound to the physical evidence available, charged him only with trespassing and evidence tampering. Nowhere near what the public believed this case deserved. Because despite the tunnel, the blanket, the DNA, the tally scratched like a countdown to nothing, no trace of Renata herself was ever recovered. Not there. Not anywhere. In the weeks after the trespassing charge was formally entered, Ashworth found herself returning again and again to a single, nagging inconsistency that nobody else on the task force seemed willing to sit with. The tally scratched into the tunnel wall contained 41 marks. 41 nights, if the pathologist's theory held, of someone counting the passage of time in a space with no windows and no clocks. But Renata Colby had been missing, at the moment the tunnel was finally discovered, for exactly 118 days. If she had truly been held there, the arithmetic simply refused to close. 41 marks left a gap of 77 days entirely unaccounted for, 77 days in which either the tally had stopped being kept, or the person keeping it had been moved somewhere else entirely, somewhere investigators had never thought to look. That single unresolved number became, for Ashworth, the loose thread she could not stop pulling. She requested access to Reyes's full financial and rental history stretching back 3 full years, well beyond the timeline anyone had previously bothered to examine, and buried in a stack of records that had already been reviewed twice by 2 different analysts. She found something everyone else had missed. A separate storage unit, rented under yet another slightly altered version of his name, in a facility 80 miles from where he had eventually been arrested, its monthly payments made faithfully in cash for over 2 years, the last payment logged only 9 days before his arrest. When investigators finally forced open that unit's rolling metal door, the space inside was nearly empty, swept unnervingly clean, the concrete floor scrubbed pale in patches that stood out starkly against the surrounding grime, The unmistakable signature of someone who had recently and deliberately erased whatever had once been stored there. A single luminol test lit the floor in a pattern that made even the forensic technicians go quiet. A faint bluish outline consistent with a large quantity of blood having once pooled there and later been cleaned, though degraded too far by time and chemical exposure to yield anything close to a usable DNA profile. The facility's owner, an elderly man who ran the storage lot largely alone and rarely reviewed his own security footage unless prompted by a complaint, recalled almost nothing useful when questioned, only that the tenant renting that particular unit had always paid on time, always arrived after dark, and had never once, in over 2 years, exchanged more than a passing nod with him at the front gate. It was, investigators noted with a quiet, creeping unease, exactly the kind of relationship a careful man builds when his entire purpose is to remain forgettable, to leave behind nothing in another person's memory worth mentioning to a detective years later. It was not proof. It would never hold up as proof in the way courtroom evidence demands. But it told Ashworth something she had already begun to suspect in her own private, unspoken way, that the tunnel beneath the shopping center was never the end of Renata Colby's story, only its opening chapter, a temporary holding place before something else happened to her somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had since been meticulously wiped of every trace that could ever bring her home. This discovery reopened the investigation in a way nobody had anticipated, drawing in a regional task force with jurisdiction to examine similar unsolved disappearances across 3 surrounding counties. What they found, when they finally cross-referenced missing person reports against Reyes's documented movements and employment history over the preceding decade, was a pattern that made the entire department go silent during the briefing where it was first presented. 2 other women, both in their early 30s, both reported missing under circumstances involving an abandoned vehicle and an unexplained gap in surveillance footage, had vanished in towns where Reyes had, at some point in the years prior, held brief maintenance contracts. Neither case had ever been connected to the other. Until now, they had simply been 2 more names added to the quiet, growing ledger of American women who disappeared from ordinary places on ordinary days and were never adequately searched for again. Reyes, when confronted with this pattern during a final round of questioning, said nothing at all. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply looked, according to the 2 detectives present in that room, as though a great and terrible weight had finally been set down after being carried for a very long time, an expression that unsettled both officers far more than any confession could have. His attorney ended the interview within minutes. He has not spoken to investigators since. The families of the 2 other missing women, once quietly notified that their loved ones' cases had been reopened and connected to a name for the first time in years, responded with a mixture of relief and fresh devastation that Ashworth found almost unbearable to witness firsthand. One mother, driving 4 hours to sit across from Ashworth in person rather than receive the news over the phone, asked only a single question before breaking down entirely. She wanted to know whether her daughter had been afraid. Ashworth, bound by the limits of what the evidence could actually confirm, could offer no honest answer that would bring this woman any real comfort. Only the same careful, practiced language investigators reach for when the truth is simply unavailable to them, a sentence that satisfies no one and closes nothing. More than 2 years later, the file remains open, not solved, not closed, suspended in the gray territory that swallows so many American disappearances, where investigators hold more fragments than narrative, and a family is left building its own private theory of a loss that never finds a door to close behind it. Ashworth still keeps a photocopy of that original grocery list in her desk drawer, its folds worn soft from being taken out so many times. She's never explained why. Those close to her suspect it has less to do with Renata now than with a sister who once walked out of a laundromat carrying unfolded towels and left behind no card, no list, no clue at all. What lingers, long after every piece of evidence has been carefully logged and shelved away in a room that may never see daylight again, is simply the unbearable ordinariness of how it all quietly began. Milk, eggs, coffee filters, birthday candles, for private words meant only for the woman who wrote them. It leaves one uncomfortable, lingering question behind for anyone still listening. How many of us move quietly through the small rituals of an ordinary week, planning a birthday, carrying a debt we have never once confessed, with no idea at all that this particular Tuesday, this one unremarkable errand, might become the very last ordinary moment anyone will ever witness of who we truly were.